The HOA bulldozed a luxury farmhouse at sunrise, thinking it was just defiance on dirt. But beneath that porch swing lay a deed that controls every square foot of their empire. Because the land they tried to erase owns their bylaws, their boardroom, and their fate. Now the one they tried to break is the one who owns the county. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. They say the land remembers who it belongs to. After 22 years in a glass and steel corporate tower in downtown Charlotte, I finally decided to belong somewhere again. I signed the deed with ink that shook slightly from exhaustion, not nerves, and left behind the high heels, the parking decks, the noise, the meetings, the artificial air, and the forced smiles. I traded it all for sky. 40 acres of sky, to be exact. The farmhouse was a miracle. An 1890s Queen Anne, lovingly restored by a preservationist couple who ran out of steam just before finishing the east wing. I saw potential in every inch: the faded rose-colored trim, the creaky barn doors, the orchard half swallowed by wild honeysuckle. It didn't scare me, it called to me. I planted herbs. I built raised garden beds with reclaimed cedar. I relearned how to breathe. Within 3 months, the porch swing became my office, the barn my sanctuary, and the land my barner. I named the property Wren Hollow. The wrens came every morning, as if on cue. Neighbors were distant but polite. Mostly older folks, retired, enjoying the quiet. It was, as one visitor told me, a page out of a different century. Until Ronald arrived. He drove a shiny black SUV. Not muddy like mine, not dusty like the feed truck. Just polished, clinical, and misplaced. His smile was all teeth, none of it sincere. He introduced himself as Ronald Eastman, president of the Birchwood Trails HOA, located just 2 miles west. He said it as if he were delivering a royal title. "Oh," I said, puzzled. "I'm not part of Birchwood Trails." "That's where it gets interesting," he replied, already pulling out a manila folder. Inside were maps, bylaws, and a highlighted section of something he called the Perimeter Covenant Overlay. According to Ronald, a clause in their amended charter gave the HOAO some oversight on bordering properties for aesthetic continuity and drainage compliance. I smiled politely. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "You'll want to paint the barn something within the earth tone palette," he added, tapping his page. "We usually recommend sandridge or adobe smoke. Also, your fencing will need to be approved. The split rail doesn't meet Birchwood's visual standards." "Mr. Eastman," I said with a smile that matched his tone, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm in an unincorporated agricultural zone. I'm not under your HOA." He didn't blink. "We'll sort it out. Just wanted to introduce myself." He left. The SUV turned around slowly, deliberately, and disappeared over the hill. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Violation notice, non-compliant structure paint. Barn structure currently painted in unapproved red tone. Must be painted to code by May 31, or face assessment. I laughed hard actually. I poured myself a sun tea and pinned the letter to my kitchen corkboard under unsolicited nonsense. A week later, a second letter, then a third. They cited excess livestock, though I had only 3 horses and 2 goats. They questioned vegetative encroachment, apparently referring to my blackberry bushes. Then came the one that made my skin crawl. Notice of required architectural review submission for East Wing porch renovation. I hadn't even started the porch work yet. Who was watching me? That's when I began noticing things. A drone buzzing once over my barn in the early morning. A strange man, not from around here, parked off the access road with binoculars. My motion sensor camera picked up movement at 3:12 a.m. one night. Just a flash of a figure at the edge of the orchard, too far to ID, but enough to make me lock the gates and double-check the dogs. I asked my neighbor Earl, a soft-spoken Vietnam vet who kept bees on his back lot, if he'd ever had trouble with Birchwood Trails. "Oh, Ronald?" he said, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, he tried this a few years back with the McKinleys. Claimed the HOA could fine them for a broken weather vane. Man's got a Napoleon complex and a map he drew himself." I should have felt better, but I didn't. Something about Ronald wasn't just annoying. It was surgical. The way he watched, the language he used. Overlay jurisdiction. perimeter enforcement, non-compliant structures. This wasn't about barn paint. This was about control. And I'd come here for freedom. But it turns out, even 40 acres of wide-open land can't stop someone who's convinced the rules are his to write. And he was just getting started. The first time they came, it was almost comical. A silver sedan pulled up at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Two men in polos and khakis stepped out. One with a clipboard, the other with a laser rangefinder. They didn't knock, they didn't wave. They just started walking the perimeter of my land like they owned it. I met them at the gate, coffee in hand and a German shepherd at my side. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Routine assessment," the taller one replied. "We're from the Birchwood Trails HOA. Just verifying fencing setbacks and visual compliance." I raised an eyebrow. "This is private agricultural property." He gave me a stiff smile. "That's being debated." They took pictures of my stable, my compost bins, even the hummingbird feeders on the porch. That night, I emailed Ronald directly. Short and simple. "Mr. Eastman, your representatives trespassed on my land today. For the last time, I am not under your HOA. You do not have jurisdiction here. Stay off my property. Charlotte Ellison Wright." His reply arrived 17 minutes later. "Charlotte, I suggest you read the HOA Perimeter Covenant Agreement again. Easement access and shared visual standards apply to all contiguous parcels within 2 miles. Your refusal to comply will be treated accordingly. Wordle Eastman." He attached a PDF. It was 6 pages of poorly scanned bylaws with heavy red underlining. Not one word was legally binding on unincorporated farmland. But Ronald wasn't interested in the law. He was interested in leverage. The inspections kept coming. Different cars, same men, clipboards, measuring tapes, cameras. One brought a drone that hovered above my greenhouse for 14 straight minutes. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line twice. Both times, the deputies shrugged. "OS can be tricky." One said, "If you're not in it, you should be fine." Should. By mid-month, I was getting violation notices almost daily. A few favorites. Unauthorized fencing height, vertical posts, exceed 48 inches. Inconsistent roof shingles on east-facing barn slope. Unapproved livestock structure. Goat enclosure, lacks aesthetic conformity. Every notice came with a warning. Failure to respond within 10 business days may result in corrective measures. What kind of corrective measures? Ronald didn't say. Instead, he left voicemails. Calm, smug, condescending. "Charlotte, this will go smoother if you cooperate. We have a system that works for everyone. You're the outlier. It's not personal, but non-compliance has consequences." I saved everyone. I wasn't raised to back down. My grandfather was a land surveyor who used to say, "Property is the only thing they can't take from you, unless you let them." I decided Ronald wasn't going to take a damn thing. So I pushed back. I posted no trespassing signs on every fence post and backed it with a civil notice. Unauthorized entry constitutes trespassing under North Carolina General Statutes 14-149-13. I installed motion-triggered cameras and linked them to my phone. I moved my goats out front just to annoy him. I repainted the barn in bright blue with a mural of a rooster flipping the bird. Ronald didn't like that. He showed up himself this time. Saturday afternoon. I was feeding the horses. He didn't knock, just opened the gate and walked straight in like he had something to prove. "You're creating hostility," he said, voice tight. "You're trespassing," I replied. "This isn't just about you," he snapped. "This is about neighborhood standards. We have retirees, veterans, children. They don't want to look at a circus when they drive by." I stepped forward, boots crunching gravel. "Let me be absolutely clear," I said. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is unincorporated county land, zoned agricultural, protected under state exemption statutes. Your bylaws stop at the Birchwood Trail sign. I don't care how many PDFs you print." He smiled again. All teeth, no soul. "You're making a mistake, Charlotte." "No," I said, dead calm. "You are." He left. But the threat lingered, coiled beneath his polished words, and I knew this wasn't over. Ronald wasn't trying to enforce anything. He was trying to wear me down, to isolate me, to grind me into submission with enough paperwork and procedural nonsense to make surrender feel like relief. But I hadn't come this far. Rebuilt my life, reconnected with the earth, reclaimed my peace, just to let a petty tyrant with a folder full of false authority tell me how tall my fence should be. He could keep sending letters. He could keep flying drones. I'd just keep fighting. Because I had something he'd never understand. Rootedness. And this land remembers who it belongs to. I didn't go to the county recorder's office looking for a fight. I went looking for clarity. After weeks of citations, veiled threats, and drone flyovers, something in me snapped. Not out of fear, I was done being afraid, but out of necessity. If Ronald was going to weaponize paperwork, then I needed to understand my own arsenal. The clerk behind the counter was young, distracted, and hopelessly uninterested. When I asked for parcel records and jurisdictional overlays, he pointed me toward the public terminal with a muttered, "You'll need to request archived scans if it's pre-7." I was halfway through the 63-page PDF of my property's original acquisition file when someone cleared her throat behind me. "You're looking in the wrong folder," she said, voice low and certain. I turned to see a woman in her late 60s, her gray hair swept into a no-nonsense braid, a lanyard with a worn name tag, Martha Lindell, retired volunteer docent. "You've got a land trust parcel," she added, sliding into the chair beside me, like a chess master about to correct a sloppy opening move. "You need the Wright County Easement Index." I blinked. "How do you know that?" "I cataloged it," she said with a smile. "Back when people still wrote in ink and sealed things with wax." "Who's pushing you?" "Birchwood Trails HOA," I muttered. Her eyes narrowed. "Eastman." I nodded. She didn't ask anything else, just pulled out her old keycard, logged into a hidden archive folder, and brought up a grainy microfilm scan tagged Wright Ellison Consolidated Deed, and there it was. Not just the deed to my land, but an old mineral rights clause that connected my property to 5 surrounding parcels. Apparently in 1957, my grandfather, Charles Wright, had merged multiple tracts under a temporary rural trust for tax relief during a drought year. The trust was never dissolved, just forgotten. Which means, Martha said, already a step ahead. You're not just exempt from HOA oversight, you actually hold partial governance rights over the Birchwood perimeter parcels. I stared at the screen. Governance? Land trust voting rights. You have 1/3 council vote on any zoning amendment touching that territory. And this clause here, she pointed to a curled signature line, faded but legible, grants you easement override power if development threatens agricultural designation. My throat went dry. Ronald hadn't just overstepped. He'd built his entire HOA on a foundation that ran through me. I wasn't inside his fence. He was standing on my land. I thanked Martha and printed everything. 3 separate documents, each notarized and scanned into the official register. She even helped me draft a formal notice of discovery and a legal intent to enforce property rights, should the HOA make one more move. "Charlotte," she said before I left, "men like Ronald build castles on paper, but old deeds are stone." I drove home in a trance. The sun was setting, but I didn't feel tired. I felt steady. The barn still stood. The goats were bleating at the gate. The hummingbirds darted above the rosemary bush like they had every morning. But I saw everything differently now. This land wasn't just my home, it was my heritage, my leverage, my line in the sand. Ronald thought I was a woman with a barn and a few chickens. He didn't know I was the silent shareholder in his entire kingdom. And he was about to find out. I printed the letter on heavy ivory cardstock. Not because I'm dramatic, but because I wanted Ronald to feel the weight of it when it hit his desk. Cease and desist. Formal notice of property governance rights. Easement override and zoning protection per Wright Ellison Trust. 3 notarized attachments. Legal citations. A copy of the mineral rights clause. And a final page outlining civil penalties for trespass, harassment, and unauthorized surveillance. It was clean, cold, lawful. I mailed it certified, return receipt requested. Then I sent a copy directly to the county attorney's office, flagged for review under agricultural protection and rural easement enforcement. I waited. Ronald didn't. Within 2 days, he mocked it during a Birchwood HOA meeting, which I knew because a recording leaked to me via someone's teenage granddaughter, who thought the whole thing was kinda based. She thinks she owns the county, Ronald laughed to his board. Wants us to believe Pinterest printouts and vintage deeds mean something in 2020. He waved my letter in the air like a flyer for a bake sale. But the next week, the HOA meetings stopped. Emails went unanswered. The citations disappeared. Ronald's SUV didn't pass my property even once. For 2 glorious weeks, there was silence. I almost believed it was over. Then came the morning I'll never forget. I'd gone into town early for seed, a post office run, and coffee. Nothing dramatic, just the normal rhythm of a life rebuilt with dirt under your fingernails. By the time I came back, it was gone. Not the house. Not all of it, but the entire eastern wing, the original parlor, sunroom, and guest quarters, flattened. Crushed like someone had driven through it with a machine and never stopped. The air still smelled of diesel. There were tire marks in the gravel. Broken porcelain scattered through the soil like bones. The antique stained glass window I'd salvaged from a church sale was in shards across the ground. The porch swing was folded in half. A cross-section of the house was now open to the wind, like a dollhouse cracked in two. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood in the driveway, hands trembling, and felt a stillness I hadn't known since my father's funeral. That surreal moment when something permanent is not. I called 911. Then I called the county attorney. Then I called Martha. The sheriff arrived first. He asked me if I'd recently hired any contractors. I told him no. He asked if I had enemies. I didn't answer. Instead, I handed him a copy of my cease and desist letter and pointed to the clause marked easement violation penalties. Then I showed him the drone footage from my motion cameras. The grainy footage didn't show faces, but it showed a backhoe arriving at 5:13 a.m., escorted by a white truck with municipal plates. The same truck Ronald often parked at HOA meetings. It didn't take long. By 4 p.m., I had a name, Holloway & Sons Excavation, a licensed county contractor. I also had a connection, the owner's brother-in-law, a part-time code inspector in Birchwood Trails, and Ronald's golfing partner. But the real break came at sunset. I got a call from Jack, the foreman of Holloway & Sons. Height hadn't reached out to him, someone else had. But Jack, bless him, had a conscience. And a granddaughter who followed me on social media. He told me Ronald had submitted a demolition order, citing blight correction under Suburban Development Code Section 18.4. Jack hadn't checked. The paperwork looked official. But when he reviewed it after my call, something didn't sit right. The signature's off, he said. And it's not even the right code for rural zones. It's bogus. He agreed to meet to talk, to go on record. Suddenly, this wasn't a zoning dispute. This was felony destruction of private property done under a forged permit using county resources on trust land. And Ronald had just bulldozed part of the land that governs him. He thought he was above the law. He'd forgotten who wrote the law and whose signature still held weight buried in brittle paper, decades deep. The farmhouse could be rebuilt. But what came next? That couldn't be undone. I didn't cry. Not when I saw the parlor window shattered. Not when the antique plaster molding lay in broken curls across the porch floor. Not when the goats stood silent by the debris, ears twitching, confused by the violence of machines. Tears weren't going to help me now. Evidence. I walked the wreckage with a clipboard in one hand and my phone camera in the other. I took 107 photos from every angle at every distance. Measurements, tracks, concrete dust. Every exposed joist and fracture line, logged like a coroner preparing a murder file. Then I opened my binder. Charlotte Ellison Wright v. Birchwood Trails, HOA et al. Tabs marked cease and desist, deed documents, zoning, camera logs, drone paths, witnesses. I filed a criminal complaint with the county. Trespass, malicious destruction of private property, and unlawful use of eminent domain procedures without jurisdiction. I copied the district attorney's office. But the key, the lever I needed to flip this whole structure on its head, was Eli Holloway. I hadn't seen him in 6 years. He was my godson's godfather, a good man with calloused hands and the kind of voice that didn't rise unless something was burning. He ran Holloway & Sons Excavation, the very company Ronald used to flatten half my home. I didn't accuse him. I just asked him to meet. We sat on the tailgate of his truck in a gravel lot behind the feed store. He looked tired, older. Regret was already written on his face before I opened my mouth. I didn't know it was your house, he said. Didn't even cross my mind. We got a job order through the code office. Looked official. Permit was signed. Said it was an emergency structure correction. Claimed the wing was unstable. I showed him my survey reports, the drone footage, the emails. He paled. Then I showed him the copy of the demolition permit Ronald had filed. Eli went still. This ain't the right signature, he muttered. This isn't even the current form. They updated permits 2 years ago. Look at the watermark. That's old county letterhead. He looked up. This was forged. I pressed record on my phone. Ellie didn't stop me. I can tell you exactly how it happened, he said. Ronald's friend Marcus? He works part-time at code enforcement. He's signed off on stuff before, but this had Ronald's prints all over it. He used our equipment, my license, to pull this off. And I'll testify to that. That was all I needed. In a single day, Ronald Eastman had gone from self-righteous bureaucrat to criminally liable, caught falsifying county documents, misusing public resources, and orchestrating destruction of land under protected trust governance. I called Martha next. She brought coffee and a fireproof envelope from her home archive. Inside, a handwritten letter from my grandfather to the county board in 1962, confirming ongoing oversight rights for the Wright Ellison Trust over any development within a half-mile of the merger parcels. Ronald hadn't just broken the law, he'd broken it on trust land. And the courts would see that distinction, loud and clear. By the end of the week, I had a sworn statement from Eli, a digital forensic analysis showing metadata inconsistencies in the permit, drone and motion sensor footage of the equipment, voicemails from Ronald hinting at corrective action, and historic legal documentation proving my authority over the land in question. The county DA's office went quiet. Too quiet. Until I got the call. Ms. Allison Wright, we're opening an investigation. We'd like you to come in and review your evidence with our legal team. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because things were finally moving. Ronald had bet on intimidation. He'd bet on people folding, on silence. He'd forgotten that this land was built by people with long memories, people who recorded everything, who filed things in triplicate, who signed deeds with ink and intention. And he never imagined that beneath the porch swing and porch light, there was a woman who'd been trained her whole life to recognize a war when it came disguised in paperwork. He bulldozed my home. I was going to bulldoze his foundation. Ronald wore a navy suit and a smug grin. He had 2 lawyers with him, one from the CHOA's retained firm, and one wearing far too much cologne for a municipal hearing. They sat confidently at the front of the courtroom, whispering and occasionally chuckling like schoolboys who'd memorized the test answers. They didn't know they were the ones about to be tested. I sat alone, no lawyer, just a thick binder in front of me, a crisp white shirt, and a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I had everything I needed. I just had to say it out loud. The judge entered, Honorable Mabel G. Lockridge, a woman whose silver hair and sharp glasses could slice through pretense like a hot knife through toll. She glanced at the docket, then at Ronald's legal team, then at, This is a pretrial hearing on Ellison Wright versus Eastman and the Birchwood Trails Homeowners Association. Charges include property trespass, unlawful demolition, and fraudulent permit use. Ms. Ellison Wright, are you representing yourself? I am, Your Honor, I replied. Ronald leaned over and whispered something to his attorney. Probably something patronizing. Judge Lockridge looked down again, her brow furrowed. Ellison Wright, she repeated slowly. Then she looked up at me. As in, the Wright Trust? Yes, Your Honor. A beat. The entire courtroom shifted. You could feel it, like someone dropped a match in a room filled with invisible gas. Ronald stopped smiling. I assume you are the direct descendant of Charles Wright, the judge asked. He was my grandfather. Another silence. This one longer. The bailiff blinked. Ronald's lawyer started flipping pages. The Colgone guy looked like he'd swallowed his own tongue. Let the record reflect, the judge said, now fully alert that Miss Ellison Wright is not only the legal owner of the affected property, but also a seated member of the Wright Ellison Land Governance Trust, which holds zoning and usage rights over multiple parcels in rural districts 3 and 4, including the eastern buffer of Birchwood Trails. Her gavel tapped once, light but firm. "Proceed, Miss Ellison Wright." I opened my binder. I laid out the cease and desist letter first, complete with its timestamp and signature receipt. Then the drone footage projected from the court's overhead screen, showing the unauthorized equipment entering my property before dawn. I presented the forged demolition permit, highlighting the mismatched watermark, incorrect formatting, and obsolete departmental seal. Then I played the audio file. Eli Holloway, stating clearly, "We were misled by Ronald Eastman and given falsified documentation to perform a demolition that we never would have touched if we'd known the truth." I closed the binder and looked at the judge. That structure was part of a registered historical dwelling. The HOA had no authority, no jurisdiction, and no consent. Mr. Eastman not only lied, he acted outside any and all municipal powers granted to him. Her eyes locked on Ronald. "Mr. Eastman, do you have a response?" His lawyer jumped in first. "Your Honor, we contest the claim that the permit was knowingly falsified." Mr. Eastman believed. "Belief is not a legal defense," she snapped. "Especially when the land in question is protected under the Wright Ellison Trust, a trust this court has upheld in multiple rulings over the last 30 years. She turned back to me. "Miss Ellison Wright, are you requesting injunctive relief or proceeding to civil damages?" "Both," I said. "But I also want the record to reflect that the HOA's actions violated not just my rights, but the governance boundary outlined in the 1957 merger clause. That clause, Your Honor, gives me final override on development decisions in the buffer zone." I handed her a final document. Her eyes scanned it. Then she sat back, tapping her pen once against the bench. "Well," she said, "it appears Mr. Eastman has not only violated the property rights of a trust that predates his subdivision by half a century, but did so under fraudulent pretenses against a governing body he didn't even realize existed." She paused. "Let's just say this court is taking the matter very seriously." Ronald's hands were clenched white against the table. My name had changed everything. He thought I was a stubborn woman with a barn and a boundary issue. But I was a legacy. I ceded authority. A quiet name carved into the foundation of the very county he tried to manipulate. And when he smirked that morning, he smirked at the wrong bloodline. This wasn't a protest anymore. This was a reckoning. It started with a headline: HOA destroys historic farmhouse, built on protected county trust land. The story ran on the local station's 5 o'clock news. I hadn't contacted them. Someone at the courthouse had tipped off a reporter, and once they dug into the public records, the story practically wrote itself. A quiet woman, a family trust, a rogue HOA president, a forged permit, a bulldozed home. The footage showed the rubble in crisp high definition. My grandmother's porch swing, snapped in two, splinters from the sunroom's French doors. But right in the middle of the frame, spray-painted across the broken front steps in bold red letters: "Justice coming." The photo went viral within 48 hours. At first I was overwhelmed. Then the calls started. Earl from down the road, the beekeeper, called first. Said he'd been fined $1,200 last year for keeping unsanitary flora, his lavender bushes. 2 others emailed me anonymously. One woman, widowed, had been threatened with foreclosure over an unapproved mailbox color. Another couple said Ronald had added a noise ordinance to ban the sound of children playing outside after 6 p.m. They all said the same thing: "We thought it was just us." Turns out, it wasn't. It was everyone. The county commissioner called me personally, said the board had voted unanimously to launch a formal investigation into the Birchwood Trails HOA, including its financial practices, election procedures, and enforcement tactics. They were placing the entire HOA under audit. A week later, state zoning officials arrived in person. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Ronald had threatened. But I was the first person with the legal authority and historical standing to hit back. Suddenly, Ronald wasn't giving interviews anymore. His SUV stopped leaving the garage. The same neighbors who once avoided my eyes at the feed store now dropped off fresh bread, flowers, and quiet thank you notes. One afternoon, a teenage girl rang my doorbell, the same one who had leaked to the HOA meeting. Recording, she handed me a flash drive and whispered, "There's more." My mom was on the board. She kept everything: emails, audio, fake ballots, even reimbursements paid out to Ronald under the label consultings. The case wasn't just about land anymore. It was about abuse of power. The farmhouse could be rebuilt. But now the foundation being shaken wasn't mine. It was his. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone on my land. I felt seen. Ronald called the emergency meeting under the guise of restoring structure and accountability. That was the subject line in the HOA email blast, the last one he'd ever sent. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp at the Birchwood Trails Community Hall. Formal attire requested. Mandatory attendance strongly encouraged. His power was slipping, and he knew it. The press was circling, neighbors were whispering, and the county's audit had frozen the HOA's operating budget until further notice. But Ronald was betting on one last thing: fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of leadership vacuum. Fear of what happens when no one's steering the ship. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to see, was that I'd already replaced the entire map. I parked down the street, stepped out in clean boots and a black blazer, and walked into the hall as if I belonged there. Because legally, I did. 23 parcels made up Birchwood Trails. 17 of them had recently changed hands, quietly, over the last 2 months. I bought them through 3 LLCs. One registered in South Carolina, one in Wyoming, one through a private family trust. I owned a majority of the HOA. 3 of those parcels came with board seats. Ronald never saw it coming. The community hall was packed, tension thick as concrete dust. Some folks looked scared, others angry, but most looked tired. Tired of fines, surveillance, silence. Ronald stood at the podium, sweaty behind the collar, but still pretending he was in charge. "We must reaffirm the authority of the board," he said, tapping his notes. "This chaos threatens the entire integrity of Birchwood Trails. If we don't take back control—" "From who?" I said. Every head turned. Ronald froze. "This is a board meeting for HOA members only." "I am a member," I said, stepping forward. "In fact, I represent a voting block of 17 parcels, including 3 board seats, all properly registered." I laid the deeds on the table. The room gasped. One of the existing board members, an older woman named Delia, who'd once been fined for growing sunflowers too close to the road, blinked behind her bifocals. "I resign my seat," she said, "and nominate Charlotte to fill it." 2 others followed. Just like that, I had 5 out of 7 board votes. Ronald stammered, "You can't do this. This is hostile acquisition. This—" "Perfectly legal," I said calmly. "Per the bylaws you helped write. Majority rule, and this board now moves for a vote." I pulled out a simple motion. Motion to dissolve the Birchwood Trails Homeowners Association, effective immediately, pending final disbursement of reserve funds, to residents and full closure of all enforcement action. "Seconded," said one of my new allies. "All in favor?" I asked. Hands went up. Deliberate, proud. 5-2. The gavel came down. Motion passed. Just like that, the HOA died. No fireworks, no shouting, just quiet power reclaimed by the very people it had tried to break. Ronald stood motionless, colorless, powerless. I walked over slowly and handed him one final envelope. Inside was the ownership filing for Wright Ellison Holdings, LLC, one of the 3 shell companies. "The same trust your bulldozers violated," I said, "now owns the house next to yours." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He walked out without saying a word. As I stood at the front of the room, neighbors started to applaud. Not loud, not rowdy. Just relieved. Free. We'd untied the knot he spent years tightening. And we did it by his own rules. That night, the HOA sign at the subdivision entrance came down. A little girl, one of the ones he'd tried to find for sidewalk chalk, got the honor of swinging the mallet. That sound? It echoed for miles. The rebuild took 10 months. Not because of delays or permits, I had full authority by then, but because I wanted to do it right. Every beam, every brick, every square inch of the new farmhouse carried meaning. The east wing, once flattened, rose again with wider windows, and a sunroom that caught morning light like it was chasing redemption. We used reclaimed wood from a retired train depot. The new porch swing was carved by hand by a local vet, and across the threshold I had a line etched into the frame. Built once by love, rebuilt by justice. Wren Hollow became more than a home. It became a place to come home to. I opened the Southern Acre as a community garden. Locals came with seedlings, cuttings, and stories. We planted rows of kale, heirloom tomatoes, okra, and sunflowers. Kids painted rocks with bright colors and secret messages. One woman brought her grandmother's seeds, saved for decades, waiting for the right soil. The land welcomed it all, as if it had been waiting too. The porch light never turns off now. It stays on through the night. A symbol more than a necessity. People come by with notes, with pies, with quiet thanks. I keep a folder in the kitchen labeled letters I needed, scribbled words from neighbors who'd lived in silence under Ronald's reign. Thank you for standing up. You reminded us we're allowed to say no. I sleep better now. The HOA signs are gone. Every last one. The final one at the Birchwood Trails entrance was repurposed into a welcome board for the weekend farmers market. As for Ronald, he moved 2 counties over. Sold his house fast, too fast. Rumor has it he tried to join another HOA board, but his name came up in the audit files. That reputation doesn't wash off easily. The last I heard, he's renting a small townhouse off a highway access road. No board, no podium, no power. Somehow that feels like enough. I never wanted vengeance. Not really. I just wanted peace and a place that couldn't be taken by someone with a clipboard and a superiority complex. Now I have both. I sit on the porch most evenings, tea in hand, boots up on the railing. The wind moves through the apple trees like it's telling secrets. The barn hums with life again, and sometimes, just sometimes, I imagine my grandfather standing beside me, nodding in quiet approval. He always said, "Land doesn't belong to people. People belong to the land." I understand now. We don't just inherit land. We inherit the right to defend it. And when you do that with grace, with grit, and with the law on your side, freedom doesn't just ring. It roots itself deep and unshakable, right where it belongs. Ever tangled with an HOA that crossed the line? Sometimes the strongest deed isn't on paper, it's in bloodline and backbone. Stick around, we're just getting started. More stories like this are buried in small towns and bigger secrets. And when the next gate swings open, you'll want to be the first to hear it creak.